At Ethan Rowan's graduation, his father Caleb walked into the hall wearing a rented vest, with a faint oil stain on the cuff he could never quite scrub away, carrying a silver watch in his pocket that had once belonged to his late wife. When Caleb smiled and raised his hand across the lobby, Ethan turned to his classmates and said, quietly and plainly, "I don't know him." Caleb went still in the middle of the moving crowd, that smile still falling from his face. Before a security officer could move him along, the woman seated in the front row, Vivian Blackthorne, CEO of Blackthorne Mobility, stood up and said, "That man didn't just fix cars. He saved my entire company. Keep watching until the end to find out why the son who walked away had to bow his head before his father." The Harrington Institute of Technology held its commencement ceremony inside the Sullivan Grand Hall, a building with vaulted ceilings, polished stone floors, and rows of padded seats filled each spring with the families of engineers, investors, and executives who believed their children were destined for the kind of careers that got written up in business journals. Caleb Rowan had closed his garage for the whole day, the first full weekday he had taken off in 11 months, and he had pressed and repressed the borrowed vest 3 times in front of the bathroom mirror before finally accepting that no amount of steaming would erase the oil mark that sat just above his left cuff. He told himself it was barely visible. He told himself nobody would notice. He brought no flowers because he had never thought flowers were the right thing. He brought the watch instead, because Lydia had asked him to give it to Ethan on a day that mattered, and he could not think of a day that mattered more than this one. Ethan stood near the south entrance with Logan Ashford and 4 other classmates, all of them in academic robes over collared shirts. All of them talking in the loose and confident way of people who had never spent an afternoon wondering whether rent would clear. Logan was the son of Graham Ashford, the chairman of Blackthorne Mobility's board, and he had the kind of bone structure and easy laughter that came from growing up inside the security of old money. He was mid-story about a ski trip when Caleb appeared through the main doors and lifted his hand across the crowd, the gesture wide and unguarded, the kind a man makes when he is certain the person he loves will be glad to see him. Ethan saw the wave. He saw the vest. He saw the grease mark. He felt the temperature in his chest drop. Logan glanced across the lobby and said something casual about the maintenance staff arriving early, a joke that landed without cruelty because Logan did not even register Caleb as someone's father. The man simply did not belong to any category that required consideration. Ethan said nothing for 1 full second, and then another, and in that silence the correct answer, the true and obvious answer, was right there waiting for him to speak it. Instead, he turned toward Logan with a small and practiced shrug and said those 5 words that he would spend the next year trying to unsay in every way, except by actually saying the opposite. Caleb heard him from across 12 feet of marble floor, heard the words clearly through the ambient noise of 100 families greeting each other, and the expression that crossed his face was not anger but something quieter and more permanent, the particular kind of hurt that a person files away rather than displays, because they understand the moment is not about them. A security officer, seeing a man in a worn vest standing near the student section without apparent purpose, moved toward Caleb and asked to see his admittance invitation. Caleb reached into his coat pocket and fumbled with the small envelope because his hands were thick and his fingers were not made for precision in moments of embarrassment. And the fumbling made it worse, made him look more out of place, made the 3 or 4 people nearby glance at him with the politely averted attention people give to situations they prefer not to witness. He found the invitation. He produced it quietly. And then, before the officer could do anything further, Vivian Blackthorne, seated in the front row of the reserved section in a charcoal blazer, her name on the program as the commencement speaker, rose from her chair and spoke his name across the room in a clear, carrying voice. She said it as if it were a fact that had been waiting too long to be stated. She said, "That man was the reason millions of Blackthorne vehicles were still safe on the road." She walked forward herself, out of the reserved row, and guided Caleb personally to the seat beside her own. Caleb sat down and said nothing. He kept the wooden box in both hands on his lap and did not look in the direction of his son. Ethan watched this from across the room with an expression that had not yet settled into anything. Not shame, not relief, not understanding, only the stunned and hollow feeling of a person who has just discovered that the ground beneath a long-held lie is less solid than it looked. 3 rows behind him, Graham Ashford had already pulled out his phone. The story of how Caleb Rowan came to be sitting alone at his son's graduation required going back 22 years, to a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaning shop, in a part of the city that had not yet decided whether it was industrial or residential, where a woman named Lydia held a newborn named Ethan while her husband sat at a second-hand desk drawing circuit diagrams in the margins of a yellow legal pad. Caleb had been a thermal control engineer at Blackthorne Mobility then, not yet 30, the kind of engineer who understood systems intuitively in the way that certain people simply do, who could feel the logic of a circuit the way a musician feels rhythm, without having to count. The work consumed him happily. He was, by every account of the colleagues who remembered him, genuinely exceptional. Lydia's illness arrived when Ethan was 4 years old, a diagnosis that announced itself with the bluntness of something that does not negotiate. Caleb took family leave and then extended leave, and then, when it became clear that leave was not sufficient, he resigned. He did not do it dramatically. He cleared his desk, said goodbye to the few people who asked why, and drove home to be with his family. What he did not know, and would not fully understand until much later, was that in the weeks following his departure, a man named Graham Ashford, then Chief Technology Officer, had removed Caleb's name from the internal documentation of the project Caleb had been leading, reassigned authorship to Graham himself and a junior engineer who knew better than to protest, and reclassified Caleb in the company's records as a support technician whose contract had ended. The prototype Caleb had spent 18 months designing sat in a secure storage unit, its serial numbers now associated with a different name. After Lydia died, Caleb opened the garage. He named it Rowan Auto and Electric because it was honest, and he was a person who preferred honesty to presentation. He worked from 6 in the morning until 8 or 9 at night and sometimes later, taking every job that came through. Fleet vehicles, old trucks, the occasional classic that someone's grandmother had left them, and they did not know what to do with. When Ethan was admitted to Harrington Institute at 17, the annual tuition cost more than the garage's entire previous year of revenue. Caleb sold the only vehicle he had ever kept for himself, a 1968 Pontiac that Lydia had loved. He refinanced a portion of the garage. He picked up overnight contracts from a logistics company servicing freight vehicles, work that paid decently but required him to skip the wrist surgery his doctor had recommended twice. He did not tell Ethan about any of this. Ethan knew his father worked hard. He attributed his scholarship, the Rowan Engineering Scholarship, which funded a significant share of his tuition, to his own academic record, because the scholarship documents listed no donor by name, only a foundation reference number, which had been Caleb's explicit condition when he arranged it through Vivienne Blackthorne 3 years prior. In the first year of university, Ethan called his father every Sunday. By the second year, the calls had become shorter. By the third, Ethan had absorbed enough of the culture around him to start interpreting his past through its eyes, and what he saw there was a small garage and a father with oil-dark hands, and the faint suggestion that he had come from a place other people considered beneath notice. He began describing Caleb, when asked, as someone who ran an automotive services business. He avoided the word mechanic with a carefulness that felt, to him, like pragmatism, but was, in fact, something closer to betrayal performed in increments so small he had not yet recognized it as betrayal. Logan Ashford had a great deal to do with this. Logan was not malicious in any complicated way. He was simply someone who had never been required to imagine that a person doing physical work might also be a person with an interior life worth acknowledging. He spoke about tradespeople the way certain people speak about weather, as a background condition, not a subject. An offhand remark he made at one of their early shared lunches, that mechanics existed to clean up the mistakes engineers made, had been forgotten by Logan immediately but had lodged in Ethan like a small splinter that worked its way deeper over years. Caleb noticed the change. He received it with the patience of a man who believed that growth sometimes requires a period of confusion, and he said nothing, and he kept paying the invoices. 3 years before the graduation ceremony, Blackthorne Mobility faced a problem that its internal engineering teams were not equipped to solve. A new line of premium electric vehicles had begun exhibiting an irregular thermal pattern during rapid charging cycles. Not a fire, not yet a failure, but the kind of data signature that an experienced engineer recognized as a precursor to both. The anomaly appeared in specific charge rate conditions and then vanished, which made it worse, because intermittent failures are far harder to trace than consistent ones. Vivienne Blackthorne had ordered an internal investigation that consumed 6 weeks and produced no satisfying answer. The team knew what was failing. They could not explain why the original safeguard had stopped working. Vivienne went back to the source material. She pulled every piece of development documentation associated with the Helix Shield battery management system, the proprietary architecture that underpinned every Blackthorne vehicle produced in the last 14 years. Most of the files were dense and technical and attributed to Graham Ashford and a co-inventor named Derek Walsh. But in the earliest layer of drafts, documents that predated the official patent filing by nearly 2 years, she found annotations in a different hand, a precise and distinctive notation style that used the initials CR in the corner of each page. There were dozens of these pages. They described, in the technical language of someone who had thought about the problem from first principles, the foundational logic of the very architecture the company had built its reputation on. A retired test engineer named Walter Keene, reached through a former colleague, confirmed that CR stood for Caleb Rowan, and that Caleb had been the primary designer of the Helix Shield prototype before his departure. Vivienne drove to Rowan Auto and Electric on a Tuesday evening in November, when rain was coming down in the particular sideways way it does in industrial districts, and found Caleb under a freight van with a diagnostic cable running to a laptop balanced on a milk crate. He was not pleased to hear Blackthorne's name. He was not impolite about it, but the particular stillness that settled over him when she introduced herself made clear that the company occupied a specific and unresolved place in his history. He said he was not interested in corporate problems. Vivian told him that a thermal cascade failure in the field would injure people. Caleb came out from under the van. Within 4 hours of examining the vehicle data, Caleb identified the issue. A firmware update 2 years earlier had deprecated a small section of legacy code flagged internally as redundant. The code was not redundant. It was the sequence that prevented a localized overheat event in one battery module from propagating laterally into adjacent modules. Someone had removed it without understanding what it was, which was possible only because the person who wrote it was no longer present to explain it. Caleb wrote a corrective patch on a legal pad, explained it to Blackthorn's lead software engineer over the phone, and refused to come to the office to do so. Vivian offered him a technical executive position, equity in the company, and a retroactive licensing payment that would have altered the entire trajectory of his financial life. Caleb accepted enough to clear the refinanced mortgage on the garage and asked that the remainder be placed into an engineering scholarship fund for students from working-class families, administered through Harrington Institute. He refused the title. He refused public credit. His son was about to apply for an internship at Blackthorn, and Caleb did not want Ethan's application evaluated against any perceived advantage from a paternal connection. Vivian honored every condition. She also, without telling Caleb, asked her new general counsel to begin a quiet internal review of the Helix Shield patent history. The review took months and produced findings that sat in Naomi Pierce's office in a locked cabinet while Naomi decided what they required. When Vivian Blackthorn took the stage at Sullivan Grand Hall, the program listed her segment as a corporate partnership announcement. A joint research initiative between Blackthorn Mobility and the Harrington Institute, $20 million over 5 years, designed to create a pipeline for applied engineering graduates. It was, as planned, a clean and uncomplicated story about institutional generosity, the kind that produced polite applause and favorable press. But the ceremony had already been altered by the thing she had witnessed 40 minutes earlier in the lobby, and Vivienne was not a person who delivered planned remarks when the unplanned truth seemed more necessary. She opened the partnership announcement as expected, and then she paused. She said she wanted to speak about something that was not in the program. She described, without naming anyone yet, a man who had spent more than a decade and a half operating as an anonymous mechanic in a part of the city most of the audience would drive through without stopping. She described a man who had, at enormous personal cost, developed a safety architecture that was now embedded in the vehicles of millions of people who had no idea his name had ever been associated with it. She asked the graduates a question that was not rhetorical: whether they believed a person became successful when they stood on a stage, or whether success might be the thing a person creates that continues protecting others after everyone has forgotten who built it. Then she asked Caleb Rowan to stand. Caleb stood because she asked him to, and not for any other reason. He kept his hands at his sides and his expression composed, because the last thing he wanted was for this day, Ethan's day, to become a performance centered on his own long-deferred recognition. The hall applauded. He sat down. Dean Margaret Hollis took the microphone next, and with the particular warmth of a person who had been waiting years for this moment to be permissible, added her own account of Caleb's presence at the institution. The laboratory equipment he had repaired at no charge on weekends, the informal sessions he had run for students struggling with applied mechanics, the quiet contributions to the department's electric vehicle research unit that the department chair had mentioned to her more than once as foundational to work that had since won 2 national awards. Margaret was precise and specific and did not embellish. Every detail was documented and verifiable. Ethan sat in the third row of the graduate section and felt each item land somewhere between his ribs. He thought about the lab session during his second year, where a visiting engineer had talked through thermal regulation principles in a way that had seemed almost perfectly calibrated to the confusion Ethan had expressed to his father on the phone the week before. He thought about things he had attributed to coincidence or to his own ability and began to count with a new and unwelcome arithmetic how many of them bore the shape of someone else's care. Logan said something dismissive under his breath, something about wealthy people using small charitable gestures to build outsized public reputations. Graham Ashford had left his seat entirely. Vivian, still at the podium, turned toward the area where Graham had been sitting and asked, in a voice that carried clearly, whether he would like to explain why Caleb's initials appeared in the first-generation design schematics for the Helix Shield thermal isolation system. There was no answer from Graham's empty chair. The response came 12 minutes later, after the formal program had ended, and the hall had dissolved into the conversational noise of 400 families locating each other. Graham Ashford returned with purpose and a prepared document, a printed incident report dated 11 years back, describing a former employee named Caleb Rowan, who had taken technical notebooks from company premises without authorization at the time of his departure. Graham spoke loudly enough for the people immediately around him to hear, positioning the information as a clarification rather than an attack, which was a technique he had used successfully in boardrooms for decades. He said that Caleb had left the company before the Helix Shield system was completed, that he had taken notes belonging to Blackthorne, and that any resemblance between his current claims and the company's intellectual property was the natural result of someone trying to retroactively attach their name to work that had been finished without them. Caleb, standing a few feet away, did not raise his voice. He said the notebooks were his, written before his employment began, in a notation style he had developed years earlier, in handwriting that had not changed since his mid-20s. He said they could be examined by anyone who wanted to examine them. He said this without heat, the way a person states something they have known to be true for so long that the truth no longer needs defending, only repeating. The story did not stay inside the hall. By late afternoon, several media outlets had published items describing a dispute at a university commencement ceremony between a mechanic claiming co-invention rights to a major electric vehicle patent and the chairman of the company that owned it. The framing was not sympathetic to Caleb. The word claiming did considerable work in those early hours, and the subsequent paragraph in most of the pieces mentioned that Caleb's garage had received repair contracts from a Blackthorne-adjacent logistics firm, which implied a prior relationship that could be read as either evidence of merit or evidence of access. Ethan's phone received 18 messages before he had reached the parking lot. 2 of them were from a campus recruiter asking whether there was a statement available from his family. He did not know how to answer. He found his father by the side entrance, standing alone with his jacket over one arm and the wooden box still in hand, and he asked him, in the voice of someone who had just discovered that the structure of several years of carefully maintained self-presentation was load-bearing, why Caleb had never told him any of this. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He said, because he wanted Ethan to be proud of the man who raised him, not of a title that someone else had spent 17 years trying to erase. Ethan said that if Caleb had told him earlier, none of the last several years would have happened the way they did. Caleb recognized, with the precision of someone who had watched the gradual unfolding of a character, that Ethan was not yet sorry for what he had done in the lobby. He was sorry that the man he had been ashamed of had turned out to be worth more than the people he had been trying to impress. Those were different things. They required different kinds of repair. Caleb placed the wooden box in Ethan's hands, then walked to his car. Ethan drove to Rowan Auto and Electric that evening and found it locked. He had a key from 6 years ago. It still worked. He stood in the garage bay in his graduation clothes and let his eyes adjust to the smell of the place. Motor oil and solvent and old rubber and something underneath all of it that he recognized as the specific atmosphere of his childhood, the scent of a room where a man had worked himself into exhaustion, consistently and without complaint, for the better part of 2 decades. He found the tuition receipts in a filing folder behind the desk, each semester marked with a date and a running balance in his father's handwriting. He found the mortgage modification papers, the refinancing terms printed in the precise bureaucratic language of documents that describe the transfer of security for money. He found 3 appointment cards from an orthopedic specialist, each one showing a date that had been rescheduled and then rescheduled again, the final card carrying a note in the doctor's office handwriting that said, "Patient requests delay due to work obligations." He found a letter on Blackthorn Mobility letterhead, addressed to his father and dated 3 years ago, offering a senior technical advisory role with a compensation package whose number Ethan had to read twice. At the bottom in his father's hand were 2 words, "Respectfully declined." And behind the letters, in a craft envelope that had been folded and refolded so many times it had softened to the texture of cloth, he found what appeared to be the first-generation schematics for a battery thermal isolation system. The date on the top sheet was 18 years ago. The name in the author field was Caleb D. Rowan. There was also a letter from Lydia. She had written it during the last weeks of her illness, in the handwriting that Ethan remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists, a handwriting that was somehow both familiar and unbearably past tense. She told Caleb not to let his bitterness, she knew it was there, she said, because she knew him, become a weight that Ethan had to carry. She said that children should not be made to feel that they owe their parents the repayment of sacrifice. Sacrifice is given freely or it is not sacrifice. She said, "He will understand someday what your hands have done. Let him come to it himself." Ethan sat on the floor of his father's garage for a long time. He did not cry immediately, which was not because he was not moved, but because the scale of what he was sitting inside was too large to be processed all at once. The way a person standing in a canyon cannot see the canyon from inside it. The understanding arrived slowly, and the shame arrived with it, and the shame was not the productive kind that motivates repair, but the raw and suffocating kind that a person has to breathe through before they can do anything useful. He drove to Vivienne Blackthorn's office the next morning and asked her to tell him what had actually happened 3 years ago. Vivienne was direct without cruelty. She described the thermal crisis, Caleb's diagnosis, the correction. She told him about the scholarship. She said, "Your father turned down more money than most people earn in a lifetime, so that when you walked into this company as an engineer, you would walk in on your own record. And then you stood in a lobby and told a room full of people you did not know him because he had grease on his sleeve. Logan Ashford found Ethan the following afternoon with a different kind of conversation. Graham had asked him to make a public statement suggesting that Ethan's graduation project, a high-efficiency motor controller that Ethan and Logan had developed together, had been substantially informed by proprietary blackthorn material accessed through Caleb. Logan said the statement had already been drafted. He said the choice was straightforward. Ethan had asked his father one question about the project, a single question about heat distribution modeling that Caleb had answered in general terms using a whiteboard diagram that contained no proprietary information and would have appeared in any graduate-level textbook. He knew this. Logan knew this. Graham had drafted a statement that described it as misappropriation, because Graham needed a narrative in which Ethan was a liability and Caleb was a fraud, and the easiest way to build that narrative was to find the one small true thing. Ethan had consulted his father on a technical question and stretch it until it covered the shape of something false. Ethan sat with this for a full evening. He had the offer of a position at Blackthorn that had been communicated through formal channels, conditional on his family situation being resolved in a manner favorable to the board. He had student debt. He had a career that was at this precise moment still intact and could be protected with a single signature on a statement he would know to be misleading. He looked at the wooden box on his kitchen counter. He opened it and took out the watch. He sent every document Graham had given him to Naomi Pierce and to Vivian Blackthorn's personal address, with a cover message that was 6 sentences long and said what was necessary without elaboration. He then requested a hearing before the Harrington Academic Integrity Board and told them, on record, that his father had provided a general explanation of a fundamental principle during the project period, that this explanation had informed his thinking without constituting design input, and that he accepted whatever review the board determined was appropriate, and would accept its outcome, including the possibility of losing the credential. The board reviewed the project materials over 2 weeks and found no violation. They noted in their finding that independent derivation of a theoretical principle was not academic misconduct, but that the spirit of full disclosure was well served by Ethan's voluntary disclosure. Caleb heard about this from Margaret Hollis. He did not call Ethan. He went to the garage and worked until the evening, and when Ethan appeared in the doorway in old clothes carrying a coffee in each hand, Caleb looked at him for a moment and then said, "You did the right thing today." He said it the way a person states a fact. He did not say more than that, because one correct decision, however costly, is not the same as an apology, and Caleb was too honest a man to pretend otherwise. He handed Ethan a wrench and pointed at the vehicle on the lift, and that was the beginning. Walter Keene was 67 years old and drove a 1994 sedan that required more care than most mechanics would willingly give it, which was why he had been coming to Rowan Auto and Electric for 11 years. He arrived on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after the graduation, while Ethan was learning brake system diagnostics from a manual and an actual brake system simultaneously, and he stood in the bay watching Caleb work for a moment before saying, quietly, that he had seen the coverage about the commencement ceremony and had been thinking about something he had kept for a long time. Walter had worked as a test systems operator at Blackthorn Mobility during the period when the first Helix Shield prototype was being evaluated. He had run the vehicle through its initial thermal stress cycles. He described, in a voice that was careful and unhurried, how Graham Ashford had ordered the prototype vehicle retired and its control hardware decommissioned after Caleb's departure. Walter had removed the central control module before decommissioning and stored it in a foam-lined case in the workshop of his retirement property in a suburb 40 minutes east of the city, because he had thought even then that the order to destroy it felt wrong, and he had the particular stubbornness of a man who had spent 30 years verifying things before discarding them. The four of them drove out on a Saturday morning, Caleb, Ethan, Vivian, and Naomi, and stood in Walter's workshop while Naomi connected a portable diagnostic scanner to a module that had not been powered in 14 years. The data it carried was precise and complete. The serial number was registered under Caleb's employee ID. The firmware timestamp predated the official Blackthorn patent application by 22 months. The access log showed that Graham Ashford had physically connected to the device on 3 separate occasions after Caleb's departure. And in a compressed audio file captured during the first full system test, Graham's voice could be heard saying, "If Rowan is gone, we finalize this without his name on it." Graham's legal team moved within 48 hours to file an injunction against disclosure of the device's data, alleging that Walter had committed corporate property theft by retaining the module. The legal argument was not without technical merit, which was the point. It did not need to win. It only needed to delay. Several members of Blackthorn's board, whose personal wealth was substantially tied to the company's equity, began signaling through intermediaries that a quiet resolution might be preferable to a public proceeding. The board's compensation committee sent Vivienne a memorandum reminding her that her fiduciary duty was to shareholders. Vivienne was unmoved. She told the board that a company was not worth saving through the perpetuation of the lie on which it was built. She called Caleb that evening and told him she intended to present the full record at the quarterly shareholder meeting in 3 weeks. Caleb said he appreciated what she was doing, but asked her not to destroy the company in order to restore his name. He meant it. He had spent 17 years without the credit and had managed. He was thinking of the engineers and the manufacturing workers and the administrative staff whose employment had nothing to do with Graham Ashford's choices. Vivian said, "Those people also deserve to work for a company that has an honest foundation." She said it firmly, and Caleb did not argue. Graham moved first. He called an emergency board session and introduced a motion to place Vivienne on administrative suspension pending an investigation into whether her personal interactions with Caleb Rowan constituted a conflict of interest that had compromised her judgment as chief executive. He submitted photographs, taken by someone with access to the garage's exterior cameras, showing Vivian arriving at Rowan Auto and Electric on multiple occasions over a 3-year period. He framed this as evidence of an undisclosed relationship that had influenced her decisions regarding the Helix Shield investigation. The motion passed by a margin of 1 vote. Vivienne was suspended from operations pending board review. She lost access to company systems, her corporate accounts, and her executive communications infrastructure. She retained her board seat and her title, technically, while the suspension remained under review, which meant she retained the right to appear at shareholder meetings and to speak on the record. She used both. 3 weeks after the suspension, at the quarterly shareholder meeting held in the Blackthorn Mobility Headquarters Conference Center, Vivian arrived with Caleb, Naomi, Walter Keene, and a presentation that had been prepared on personal equipment using personal funds. Graham sat at the chairman's position with two lawyers and the expression of a man who believes that institutional architecture is on his side. Naomi walked the assembled shareholders through the documentary record with the methodical precision of a lawyer who has spent months building toward this single presentation. The Helix Shield Control Module, the firmware timestamps, the access logs, the serial number registration, the audio recording, the original patent documentation with Caleb's name appearing as lead designer, the subsequent filing with Caleb's name absent, the payment records showing a wire transfer to a patent attorney 11 months after Caleb's departure, made from a corporate account that Graham controlled, for services described as documentation review and filing support that had produced, among other things, an amended inventor disclosure listing. Graham acknowledged that Caleb had contributed to early development work. He said that, under standard employment agreements, any intellectual property developed during the scope of employment belonged to the company, not the individual. Naomi explained patiently and at length that the question before the board was not primarily one of ownership under employment law, which was a genuine complexity, but one of deliberate falsification of internal records, fraudulent amendment of patent filings, and a systematic effort to deceive both the company's shareholders and its own leadership over nearly 2 decades. Caleb spoke last. He stood at the podium for less than 3 minutes. He said he had not come to claim a company or to litigate a number. He said he had come because the next engineer who walked through these doors deserved to know that their work, done quietly and without recognition, could not simply be absorbed into someone else's name while they were looking after their family. He said he had spent 17 years as a mechanic, and he was not ashamed of it. He said the only thing worth correcting was the record, because records are what the people who come after you have to work from. Ethan stood up from the audience section and confirmed on the record that he had been approached by Graham Ashford and offered a position in exchange for a statement that would have characterized his father as someone who had improperly accessed Blackthorn research materials. He said he had declined. He said he also wanted to acknowledge, in this room and in front of these people, that he had once stood in a public hall and pretended not to know his father. He said this without being asked to. He said it because he had come to understand that the only version of himself he could build on was the one that began from the truth. And the truth was that he had been wrong and was trying, imperfectly and earnestly, to become someone less wrong. The shareholders voted. Graham Ashford was removed from the board. Vivian was reinstated with full authority. Caleb was formally recognized as the originating designer of the Helix Shield system, a designation that would be corrected across all technical documentation. An independent forensic audit of the patent history and related financial records was commissioned. The retroactive licensing fees, calculated from the date of the original application, were substantial enough that the number required a full sentence to write out. Caleb did not keep it all. The settlement reached 14 months later was detailed and carefully structured. Caleb's name was restored to every document, every filing, every technical reference that had borne another name for 17 years. A portion of the licensing fees was paid to him directly, and it was enough to retire the garage's remaining debt and fund a modest and comfortable life. The majority was directed, at Caleb's instruction and Vivian's co-design, into the establishment of a technical training center, a facility attached to the Harrington Institute campus, equipped for hands-on applied engineering work, offering full funding to students from working-class and first-generation professional backgrounds. The center had a clear and explicit policy. Students were not required to obscure or soften the details of their origins on any application or program document. Their parents' occupations were not a factor in their consideration. The facility also formalized protections for inventors within Blackthorn Mobility and its partner institutions, procedures requiring that authorship on technical documentation be reviewed by an independent function separate from the business units whose interests might be affected by attribution decisions. Graham Ashford was not prosecuted for criminal fraud. The evidentiary standard for intent, at the level required for criminal charges, was difficult to achieve, and Caleb had said clearly that he preferred correction to punishment. Civil proceedings resulting in a substantial personal settlement were handled quietly and resolved without trial. Caleb did not take a position at Blackthorn Mobility. He kept the garage. He accepted an informal advisory role with the training center, which meant he drove across town twice a week and sat with students who were stuck on problems and walked them toward understanding without doing the work for them, which was, if anyone had been paying attention, exactly what he had always done. Ethan did not accept the corporate track position he had been offered. He enrolled in the center's first cohort, entering at the lowest level and working upward, which meant spending 6 months doing exactly the kind of work he had once considered beneath the person he was trying to become. The 6 months at the garage were not sentimental. Caleb did not soften the learning to reward the relationship. Ethan changed oil and replaced brake pads and learned to listen to an engine the way a person learns to listen to language, not for individual words but for the pattern underneath them. He made mistakes and was told about them plainly. He learned how to explain a repair to a customer who did not know the technical vocabulary, how to be clear and honest without condescension, which turns out to require more skill than knowing the repair itself. He learned that his father had been practicing a form of precision for 2 decades that had nothing to do with circuits and everything to do with character. The relationship between them did not repair itself on a schedule. Caleb did not pretend the lobby moment had not happened. Ethan did not seek absolution through repeated confession. The healing was slow and structural, the way a fractured thing heals, not by returning to its original form, but by rebuilding along new lines that are sometimes stronger for having been broken. Ethan began wearing the Rowan Auto and Electric work shirt without irony. He introduced his father to colleagues by name and occupation without modification. They restored, together, a vehicle that had belonged to Lydia, a sedan she had bought used the year before her diagnosis, which had sat under a tarp in the back of the garage for 17 years. And when they finished it, they drove it on a clear Saturday morning with no particular destination. Vivian Blackthorn became, over the 14 months of settlement proceedings and center construction, someone who drank coffee at a small table in the garage office after the center meetings, talking with Caleb about engineering and policy, and the specific problems that arose when institutions tried to build fairness into processes that had previously operated on the opposite principle. Whether this was friendship or something that might eventually become more was a question neither of them was in a hurry to resolve, and the absence of hurry was. Between two people who had spent years moving quickly through difficult situations, its own kind of statement. The center opened on a Tuesday morning in October, 14 months after the graduation ceremony in Sullivan Grand Hall. Ethan stood at the podium to introduce the event's keynote speaker, who was listed in the program simply as Caleb Rowan, engineer and founding advisor. The hall was not grand in the way of Sullivan. It was a working building, functional and well lit, with the honest smell of a space designed for people to make things in. Ethan looked at the program in his hand and then at his father in the front row, sitting in a plain chair in a plain blazer, the same hands folded in his lap that had been folded around a wooden box in a lobby 12 months ago, the same hands that still bore, across the knuckles and at the base of the thumb, the traces of decades of work that soap and time had softened but never fully erased. Ethan said, "1 year ago, I stood in a room full of people and told them I did not know this man, because he had walked in wearing the evidence of what he did for a living. Today I am standing in a room full of people, and I want to say, for the record and without qualification, that there is no version of my life that begins without those hands. I spent a long time wanting to be far enough from where I started that nobody would be able to see it. I understand now that the only destination worth arriving at is the one where you are steady enough to turn around and stand beside the person who carried you there and call them by their right name." Caleb did not move to the podium immediately. He sat for a moment in the front row, and the room was quiet enough that the people nearby could see him press his hand briefly against his eyes, the gesture of a man who has arrived somewhere he was not certain he would reach. Then he stood and walked forward, and as he passed his son at the podium, he raised one hand, that same wide, unhurried, certain gesture he had made across a marble lobby 14 months before, and this time, Ethan reached out and took it. Ethan had spent years believing that success meant traveling far enough that the starting point disappeared behind him. What he came to understand in a working garage on a cold Tuesday morning was that real success is the kind of maturity that allows you to turn back around, stand beside the man who put you on the road, and speak his name out loud. Not as an explanation, not as an apology, but simply as the truest thing you know.